Thoughts, My Paths, My Destinies is a book published in Portuguese on Amazon in 2016. Written by José de Oliveira. Translation by OpenAI. The same author of the book On the Other Side of the Mountain, also published on Amazon. OpenAI analysis after translation. Reflections on the future of humanity, a call to collective consciousness. This text addresses profound and important issues about the human condition, our individual and collective responsibilities, and prompts us to reflect on the future of society. The way the ideas are presented in an articulate and engaging manner is quite captivating. It's a text that invites reflection and action, something very valuable in today's world. Starting the text. Life is frightening and at the same time fantastic, simply because we don't know how it will unfold. We can't even be certain about tomorrow. Imagining what our life will be like is simply impossible. Even though we don't know, we can still plan as we wish. In a way, that's what we think. Or rather, what a large part of us thinks. Because it wouldn't be offensive to say that many people live their lives without thinking about tomorrow, let alone a more distant future, many simply because they don't want to or don't need to. Of course, we can't ignore that many who don't think about the future do so not because they lack the capacity, but simply because they've been conditioned their whole lives not to want more than they have. This, sometimes for generations, almost like a caste, in the Indian concept. It wouldn't be necessary to use the term Indian concept if Gilberto Freire's book Casa Grande e Senzala were present in our schools. Since, in its reading, we can see the various levels of prejudice, behaviors, cruelties, atrocities that have been committed in our country. The title itself makes us reflect on a subject, the slave of the Senzala and the slave of the Casa Grande. So, it's not new that a different condition isn't enough for different treatment in the same situation. That is, depending on where you live and who you are, it will make you different even if you are the same. However, it is very easy for us to think critically that someone who does nothing to change their life does so simply out of inertia or intellectual incapacity or labor laziness. I often hear criticisms from people who had a well-structured foundation to reach much more financially or intellectually comfortable places than they find themselves in and yet have the audacity to criticize others less fortunate. This makes me wonder what leads a person who had an entire family and financial structure to criticize a person who has been conditioned for generations to live under the stigma of welfare. Not to mention that, with all their intellectual and critical capacity, they are nothing more than average in their professional and personal lives. Yet, they sit in their arrogance speaking of people who live below poverty. I have the impression that many who do this do so simply because they want to overshadow their personal failure. I don't know if I'm exaggerating, but I would say that in doing so, they try to convince themselves that they are a success by comparing themselves to the less fortunate. However, success is a very relative matter, because it depends on numerous factors, among them, individual condition, starting point, desired goal. The sociologist Emile Durkheim, in the book Suicide, shows that suicide, although it occurs in all social and regional segments, has a higher incidence due to certain characteristics, such as environment, social, economic, religious, and cultural milieu. The failure of one can be considered success for another. It all depends on the starting point and the desired goal. Returning to the book, those born in the Casa Grande will be better prepared for many things in life, while those born in the Senzala, typically, will be conditioned to a certain behavior necessary for society and for their own survival. However, it does not mean that it will be exactly like that because there are numerous factors that can change this Brazilian caste. Making an analogy with climbing, understanding that to reach the top of a mountain, the higher the beginning of the climb and the better prepared one is, the easier it will be to reach the top. However, if for some reason we return to its base, even though it is considered a setback, those who have already been at its base will have better conditions to climb again. Since they know all the paths, while those who have never been there will have the despair of something totally unknown and frightening when they look at the desired point and see the goal much further than they have ever seen. All of this leads us to the paths we follow in our lives, the options we have, the decisions we make. since I understand that life is like a big map with thousands, millions, or perhaps much more than I can count. And each path can lead us to have a completely different life from another path, even if it is right next to it. Because we are unaware of these paths and where these paths can lead us. And in this uncertainty, we follow or are led. Sometimes we have the option to choose. Since we can chart a course and follow it. I mean, a path of study, family, work, behavior. Of course, only a few privileged ones have this possibility, either due to family structure or individual capacity. Even when we have everything within a forecast, we know that none of it can go as planned, and even if every prediction is made, there is a great possibility that the results we imagine will not materialize as we would like. Since, I believe that there is not a single person who has not been frustrated or very afraid of what was to come at a certain moment in their life. Have you ever stopped to think if at a certain moment in your life you hadn't done this or that? You can also think about the possibility of having done something different from what you did. Can you imagine what your life would be like now? That's why I think that every decision, every action we take in our lives, and the paths we choose, has led us to the moment we find ourselves now. Until reaching this point in the text, it was a decision to start reading. It can be intriguing, interesting, frustrating. Regardless of the feeling, it was an action that had a consequence, whether good, bad, or without qualification. And what leads us to take certain actions? Because I have no doubt that if we choose paths that we know beforehand are not the right ones, this path could lead us to the abyss. I say could, since I can't say that choosing a knowingly wrong path could lead us to an abyss. We have many examples of people who follow paths said to be wrong and are very well off financially. However, being financially well off doesn't necessarily mean that the person is well. Therefore, being well off doesn't have a direct and unique relationship with the financial side. Being aware that we are responsible for our destiny and understanding that happiness is not exclusive to a good financial condition, we can understand that happiness is a state of personal fulfillment. Therefore, we can have a first understanding that personal fulfillment is a principle of the individual, that is, the first desired point is individual fulfillment. If we seek individual fulfillment and this is not necessarily linked to financial fulfillment, we will have to seek to understand what individual fulfillment means. Individual fulfillment, as the name itself suggests, depends on each individual. Thus, it will depend on each person. For some, it may be very simple, while for others, it may have an unprecedented dimension. Since it is something personal and each individual, regardless of their environment, economic or social, has their life goal. Therefore, it makes no sense for us to speculate here about a specific reason that leads an individual to desire something in their life, as we have infinite possibilities. However, we can try to understand the relationship between individual fulfillment and social coexistence. Then, we will have to understand the meaning of social coexistence, with the principle that we are individuals in essence. For those who do not have as a concept that the human being is an individual being, we will have to address this point before we move on to understanding the reason for social coexistence. Since if we see it in a simplistic way, it is impossible to consider ourselves individualistic simply because we see human beings living socially anywhere in the world. However, with the principle that the human being is an animal, even if some consider it rational, it is still an animal. Given that rationality is attributed to human beings due to their ability to solve problems rationally. Since, from the beginning, Homo sapiens stood out from other animals due to their rationality. In this, I believe there is no room for questioning, since currently, it is the dominant animal on the planet.
However, if we take this point as a criterion, solving problems rationally, we will have to establish levels of rationality. Because we can see that other animals are also capable of solving problems. Of course, not at the level of humans, but they do solve them. Therefore, we would have to consider that we have various levels of rationality. However, in our view of racial supremacy, we judge the actions of other species as animal instinct, ignoring and disqualifying their rational logic. We should not consider the absence of rationality when an animal solves a problem. But usually, we ask, how did it do that? And we immediately attribute it to its animal instinct. However, if it learned, had a thought process, had thought, it had reasoning. Even if it was at a basic level, it had it. It is also observed that many animals maintain a form of language. Just because we don't understand it, we consider it a basic form of communication. Whether it's basic or not, it doesn't matter, it's communication, and all communication, even basic, requires a lot of reasoning. To avoid prolonging the subject, we can observe teamwork, communication language, and social interaction in monkeys, dolphins, killer whales, ants, just to exemplify. So, without trying to prove whether this point is correct, let's proceed from the understanding that the human being is an animal with greater rationality among the known ones. If we are animals and studies show that animals living in groups are interested in a certain goal, we will also have to establish this objective for our society. Thus, we return to the point where the human being was considered an individual being who lives in society for a greater purpose. So, this brings us back to the starting point, the paths we choose lead us to an unknown destination, that is, everything done by our ancestors, from the first hominids, has led us to this moment. Of course, as was said, by unknown paths without knowing where we would end up, and we follow paths that we do not know where we are going. However, as it was also said, we can predict a result by the paths we follow, exemplifying global warming, scarcity of raw materials, arable land, overpopulation, absolute poverty, absolute wealth. If we follow paths that we do not know, but still, we can predict some results and we are the being with the greatest rational capacity living on Earth, how do we explain what is predicted for our short-term future? It becomes so inconsistent that the being with the greatest rational capacity on Earth is capable of producing its own destruction. This, in itself, proves that the human being is a totally individualistic being. Because it thinks for its own immediate personal benefit, that is, it is selfish and irresponsible. A simplistic analysis leads us to understand that selfishness is one of the characteristics of an individualistic being and that irresponsibility is not a characteristic of a rational being. So, we would have to conclude that the human being is a selfish being with relative rationality. Therefore, we would have to analyze what level of rationality the human being has. The unprecedented exploitation of raw materials, arable land, industrial production, natural resources has no other result than scarcity and consequently the decrease of the species. Of course, extinction will not come through this means, as we are a species that adapts very well to any environment and situation. However, there are numerous consequences, such as making life a very dangerous adventure. An animal's principle is to survive. Therefore, nothing will prevent it from seeking its survival regardless of the consequences of its actions. But what can be said when actions do not seek survival but the accumulation of goods, to such an extent that one will not be able to consume 1% of what one has accumulated, and furthermore, it will leave many without the minimum for survival. To exemplify, in a basic situation, we would have the following situation. On one side a being that accumulates a fortune impossible to be spent during a whole life or for several generations and on the other extreme a being totally excluded from the minimum basics for its survival. This equation has no other result than direct conflict. The selfish one wanting to accumulate even more than he can spend and the excluded one seeking something to survive. What is the predictable result of this equation? Returning to the studies of animals, citing as an example, the experience of rats in a cage. In an environment with plenty of space and food, there is almost no conflict among them. However, when the environment becomes insufficient to ensure quality of life, due to population growth and food no longer being sufficient for everyone, this same environment, the same species, the same food makes conflict inevitable. Observing this research, we have some points to consider. It does not depend on the species. It does not depend on the location. It does not depend on the food. Thus, we can say that what leads to aggression is the need for survival, regardless of the species. This is a point we can consider at first. Imagining this situation in human society, conflict becomes natural due to the scarcity of food and space. Viewing from this angle, we can understand that the human being is not a selfish being but a survivor. With the large population and scarcity of space and food, material goods, conflicts arise, being a natural action for a certain situation. This form of comparison is not a flight of fancy. Since, according to Darcy Ribeiro, in the book, The Brazilian People, when populations lived in tribes, they did not have the concept of property, and the central goal of the group was the tribe's own survival, and this behavior can still be seen in the remaining tribes. Following this analysis, we can return to the point of choosing the paths we have taken, that is, the paths we have chosen within predictability. Therefore, if we put a large number of people in an environment that cannot accommodate everyone with quality and sufficient food, the result will be conflict. In our case, in addition to food and space, we can also consider leisure, health, education, among others. Given that we are a more demanding species. Considering that we are a result of the environment we live in or the environment transforms man. We also have to consider another question, which I think is crucial, the formation of an adult. When we are born, we are a being that has no natural instinct, as can be observed in other animals that live in constantly risky situations. Many newborn animals learn to walk and run shortly after birth, such as zebras, gazelles, and antelopes of the African plains, among others. Humans, among other animals, are entirely dependent on parents for their survival for a long period. Speaking only of the human species, when we are born we have no concepts and no preconceptions, we are a blank slate. With interaction, we form our concepts and preconceptions, learning to live in this world. Therefore, our formation is the exclusive responsibility of our family and society. Therefore, the family and society cannot absolve themselves of the responsibility for what we become. Considering family and social responsibility, I want to exemplify with a situation observed in Africa during an elephant relocation in a reserve. At first, they transported young animals, with the aim that they would identify with the new region. It was thought that in this way, these animals would take that region as theirs when they became adults. However, the result was not what they expected. The young elephants became aggressive, within our concept, delinquents, invading the plantations of the villages surrounding the reserve, including the villages themselves, advancing on the residents. After a period of study and understanding of the situation, they decided to place some adult female elephants to accompany the young ones. What was subsequently observed was a complete change in behavior. The young ones became calmer and more confident, as they had the protection and guidance of an adult. Having this understanding, we can make an analysis with our society, without delving deeper. This type of behavior seems very familiar to us, that is, youth raised without a family bond, without proper guidance, becomes delinquent. Regardless of social, regional, or financial situation. Taking as a principle that the animal needs guidance and protection to become an adult with behavior considered normal and acceptable, we return to the point of the paths we choose with predictability. As mentioned, if we follow a path that we know beforehand will lead us to a precipice, we will surely reach that precipice. However, it does not mean that we will necessarily fall from this precipice. Because we always have the option to change. Yet, if society does not take responsibility for individuals left on its margins, it cannot consider itself responsible for their order, judging and punishing them. Given that, as we can understand, it was society itself that marginalized them, holding them responsible for the dehumanization of humanity. However, the marginalized, indoctrinated, impoverished, and excluded cannot be held responsible for a structure that is the responsibility of the dominant, included, indoctrinators, and holders of global wealth. Understanding that the world is the result of the paths that humanity has taken and the future will have the predictable result of the actions being taken and to be taken, we can comprehend that everything we live and are is a consequence of collective responsibility. In short, we are the product of what we do. If we understand that we are the product, knowing that the product varies depending on the factors and having the knowledge that the order of the factors does not alter the product, we would have to discover which factors would be necessary to have a quality product. Here is the big question. What are the factors that can produce a quality life for everyone? However, before we seek to understand which factors can produce a quality product for our society, we can try to discover what sets us apart from other animals. Due to what was said earlier, rationality is a relative quality that most animals possess in one way or another, to greater or lesser degrees than others. Also, we speak of human inconsistency. We cannot consider ourselves the most rational species on our planet. Given that, it is inconsistent to consider ourselves superior rational beings if we destroy the place where we live. Nor can we consider social coexistence as exclusively ours, since many other animals also live in groups. Of course, the way I wrote it may seem different, living in a group, living in society. However, in practice, it means the same thing. In a way, we protect ourselves from ourselves within a community, excluding those who do not belong to the same group. Nor can we absolve ourselves of responsibility for the paths we know the results of in advance. This item could even be a point for us to consider as a differential. However, the fact that we have the knowledge and do not take any action is the same as not having such knowledge. So, what sets us apart? Even with a pessimistic view of our humanity, we have something surprisingly fantastic. The number of people doing good, respecting others is much greater than the number of people who do evil. If this factor is true, I understand that the act of doing good without looking at who can be considered something that sets us apart from other animal groups. Of course, talking about practicing good in such a chaotic world is contradictory. Still, just by observing, I do not see other species practicing something similar. However, if we have this differentiated capacity, how do we explain evil everywhere? What is missing for good to be predominant in the world? Fighting to share everything with everyone equally? Someone or a group having access to all the wealth of an organization, city, country, the world, and not wanting everything for themselves, their family, and friends? Who would be fair enough to have power and not be corrupted? Or better, who could be the Lord of the Rings without being possessed by evil? We have numerous examples of saviors of the homeland who, after coming to power, forget everything they preached, and in one way or another, their actions become what they criticized so much. However, I do not have the illusion that power corrupts. I am certain that the corrupt seek power to satisfy their individual objectives. These individuals are, if we can establish a scale to measure this type of behavior, holders of the highest level of selfishness possible. When they use the system to gain what they desire, they affect millions of people. So, how to classify a person who steals public money? 1. Money to build a hospital, should be held responsible for all the harm that the lack of the hospital can cause. 2. Money to build a school, frustrating thousands of futures. 3. Money from school meals, taking from those who have nothing. No less guilty is the so-called businessman who participates in the scheme, the inspectors, judges, and servers responsible for oversight, and the society that does not follow. What about the individual who feels like a victim and instead of seeking their rights, evades taxes and still has the pride to say that they only do it because corruption plagues the country? Nevertheless, they forget that these taxes would also build hospitals, schools. Everyone, without exception, does not feel guilty for their actions. Because the system forces them to have this type of behavior. Forced, coerced to practice acts that they would never dare to think. In other words, they feel victims of an existing system that transforms them into people they are not. This brings us back to the previous question, what is lacking for good to triumph in the world we live in? Considering that we are a species of good, which practices evil because it is forced by an existing system. In a practical analysis, fighting for good to triumph. However, if good fights, it will cease to be good. There is no good when good does evil, even if it is evil for a greater good. Good is pure, it is love, it is compassion, it is charity, it is peace, it is a gift. And how to make good victorious without fighting? It is difficult to answer this question, because we are raised, indoctrinated to succeed in life. And we are also taught that without struggle, without pain, there is no victory. How to react to evil without defending oneself. How is it possible to fight without warring? If we fight, we will war. If we war, we will cause evil. If we cause evil, our action ceases to be of good. Quoting Buddha, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This phrase is very current. The conflicts in the Middle East aim to eliminate terrorist acts. However, what we see is hatred generating more hatred, in an almost endless escalation on both sides. Of course, all this that happens does not aim to bring peace to the region but to exploit the wealth of the place, in this case, oil. When there is no more oil, the interest in promoting the so-called democracy in these regions will also end. Only I do not know if it will end the hatred implanted for generations. At this point, we can return to the beginning of this text, the paths we choose predictably. We had and have the opportunity to change our paths, even without being sure where these paths will lead us. However, we can be sure that if the path followed is towards a precipice, we will reach that precipice. And the big problem will be when we get there and have no way out. The path we are currently following is leading us to our abyss: global warming, absolute poverty, social inequality, gratuitous violence, distorted values, schizophrenic epidemics. This is neither new nor can we consider it something from the last centuries. These behaviors seem to be ingrained in our DNA. Eric Fromm, in the book Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, deals with this destructive behavior of humanity and also shows that the behavior often attributed to a certain external factor is already part of the individual's personality. In short, the characteristics and ingredients for the practice of evil are already within the personality. The external factor is only a stage that becomes reality. However, I do not fully agree with this position. Because I consider that except for pathological cases, the human being is born free of concepts and prejudices, as mentioned before. Of course, this aggressive personality can be explained by factors in their childhood and upbringing. This brings us back to the question we spoke of regarding the responsibility of family and society in shaping the adult. Only using as a parameter the research mentioned in this text. What I see in the current world are children raised without adequately protective guidance, turning them into juvenile delinquents, who will be responsible for the education and formation of the next generation, in a continuous and dangerous path. Because they will be people raised by others who had minimal guidance, and thus, the next generation will have fewer conditions to offer the following one, until the day when they probably will have nothing to offer the next generation. It is incredibly difficult to imagine such a scenario. What would a generation be like without having anything to teach the next generation? It seems absurd to think in this way, as how could someone have nothing to teach? Since we have the conception that we can always learn something. Indeed, we can. Even when we hit rock bottom, we discover what the bottom looks like. The question is how to get out of it. And what are we currently doing to not hand over the bottom of the pit to the next generations? Quoting Mahatma Gandhi, each day, nature produces enough for our needs. If each one took only what they needed, there would be no poverty in the world and no one would die of hunger. However, if we continue at this pace, in a few years, there will be nothing left in the world. We will not have clean water, we will not have forests, we will not have resources, we will not have nature, we will not have animal life. Nor will we have society as we know it. In reality, our generation is responsible for the coming years. It doesn't take much analysis to know what the world will be like in 50 years or less. An example from our daily lives is the issue of clean water. How many households go days without water, and we still pay a very high price for a service that does not have the quality we would like? Have you ever imagined what it will be like in 50 years? As mentioned earlier, this will not lead to our extinction, as we are adaptable. Especially with the use of new technologies and the advancement of biotechnology. However, the development of technologies could turn humans into obsolete beings. It's not just another fancy idea. In many areas, we are no longer needed, as we have two options: we become machines in pursuit of goals and production, or we are replaced by others. However, when we are no longer capable of producing what is established by the goal, machines come into play. A simple realization is car manufacturers. In the 1970s or 1980s, the number of employees was much higher, and today production is much better and larger. In the not-too-distant future, we will be more like a fantastic chocolate factory, given that we are witnesses that modern times man cannot endure. As I mentioned two famous movies, and not to lose the sense, we will be more like the Terminator of the future. We cannot conceive of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where machines would work for men, but rather that we will work for the machines. Of course, if we are not extinct because of them. Artificial intelligence and technological development are making or have already made man disposable. This is a fact. There is currently no technology for such, but in the not-too-distant future, we will have many changes. And the evolution of technology will make the human being unnecessary. This point brings us back to the beginning of the text, the paths we choose with predictability. If we are creating machines with so-called artificial intelligence that can perform any job without complaining, without demanding, without rest, without unions, without rights, and having artificial intelligence, what destination will this path lead us to? The answer, to our abyss. It is not a criticism of technological evolution, it is just a fact. If the path can lead us to a certain destination, if we follow that path, we will get there. Nothing more. It's very simple, follow and you will arrive. Is there a possibility of change? I believe not. We are already too far to turn back and too close to not reach it. It is a matter of time. So, if we understand that we are rational animals, that we are responsible for the paths we follow, that we are responsible for the formation of children, that we are aware that a person who has nothing will somehow seek. That society is responsible for everything, and mainly if we understand that each of us is part of that society. Then, finally, we will be able to understand ourselves. I do not intend to enter the religious sense of the phrase but rather its dimension. Quoting the most beautiful philosophy of life I know, love your neighbor as yourself and do not do to others what you do not want done to you. Jesus Christ. How would the world be if everyone understood this one sentence? So simple, so ingenious, so supreme. For me, it is perfect and it is what I can understand. If each person did what they would like others to do to them, there would be no selfishness, no war, no struggle, no hunger, no misery. A world without misery is a very rich world. Is this possible? Yes. We can return to the point we considered as a differential, the practice of good without looking at who. The number of people practicing good in this world is much greater than those who practice evil. But we have to find a way for good to be total. As long as there is misery, injustice, hunger, and inequality, there can be no peace in the world. I will go a little further and ask. How can anyone consider themselves happy, knowing about the misery in the world? How can anyone have peace, knowing about people dying of hunger? Are we alienated, living in Wonderland? I am sure that the world is very large, and we cannot solve all its problems. But, thinking only of our world, I say, in the world we can see, that surrounds us, if we can make this small part of the world better and if each one does the same with their world, like linking cells, the world will be better. Everything we do comes back to us. Absolutely everything. When we seek to do good, good returns. When we do to others what we would like them to do to us, and others also think the same, good will prevail. No war, no struggle, no hunger, no misery, no hatred. If we are sure that no one is dying of hunger, that no one is being unjustly treated, that no one is stealing the lunch from a school in a needy region, that no one is stealing money to build a hospital, that no one is evading taxes. Have you ever imagined such a world? The Christmas dinner will be much happier. If you don't believe in Christmas dinner, it doesn't matter, your dinner, your lunch, your barbecue, your peace, your life will be much better. To finish these thoughts and not to extend them any further, I leave two phrases for us to think about. Francis of Assisi, to preach peace, first you must have peace within you. Muhammad, a man's true wealth is the good he does in this world.